Hello everyone, you'll be seeing now a retake of this talk that happened in the Bamberg 24 conference, Models of Consciousness 5. The title is Modeling Perception as Resonance, and I hope that after the talk you'll know why that is the title. I will not spoil it by just jumping right in. We've been through a few days of great conference, and if one thing has become clear, then that theories of consciousness are rather tricky. There are many definitions of what it can be. You have people dealing with Greek letters, you have people with networks and workspaces and information and brains and visual centers, and frankly some just want to eat your brain, it seems, like this gentleman on the right. So where I'm going with this is, if you talk about consciousness, you need to focus very specifically what you're going to be talking about and how you're going to go about that. And this is now a second bonus aspect of this talk, since I get the chance to retake it due to technical issues. I'll add a section before here. What we heard a lot about this conference, or in this conference, was a talk about structure. And I'll use this opportunity to give you an example of what that means, because I've met a number of people who seem to have difficulties imagining or having a good interpretation or example of what structure can be. We've heard the definitions. As a mathematician, you might be very familiar with it, but you hear that it's about relations of entities and you compare structures with morphisms. And if that doesn't mean much to you, maybe this example can help you a bit. So what you see on top here is a rendering of some colors. They are relatively random, so I've made sure that there's a lot of shiny colors in there. But what you see at the bottom is the interesting part. So what you see at the bottom is the translation of these colors into textures. And what do I mean by translation here? What I mean is that when you look at this translation in detail, it's a hobby project of mine if you want, is that the structure within the color space is maintained. So you can see that all these patterns at the bottom, the textures at the bottom, they have some features that otherwise colors have. So you can blend them, you can go from one texture to the other, and you have all the textures in between. You can add them. So if you have one pattern that represents one color on top that came from, say, the green one and the red one, if you add those two, you overlay them, just adding them by lightness, you would end up with the texture that corresponds to the color that you would have gotten if you had mixed the colors in original. So what this is an example for is that the top and the bottom of this picture are very different. I mean, one is full of black and white and one is full of colorful RGB pixels. But what I'm saying is that the structure of these two, there is a structural aspect to these two areas of the screen to which they are very similar. So that's the kind of structure that we use to talk about in mathematics, and that's sort of also in this conference many people do, and then some for this may be a new thing. So maybe this is a good intuition to take with. It's not the main focus of this talk. I just thought I'd share it with you because the opportunity presents itself. What is the topic of this talk? If you followed the consciousness science for the last couple of years, 20, 30, 40, I'm not entirely sure, when Nagel's paper came out, there's this famous question, what's it like to be a bat, for example? And there have been many papers of what's it like to be anything. What's it now? In this, we have a talk, what's it like to be an AI, a large language model? And that's typically not an easy question to answer. But I really will focus on the question of what's it like to be human. Now, we seem to think that we have a pretty good idea about that because we are humans, but can we make this scientifically accessible? Do we have, beyond what psychology currently offers, do we have good measures to describe what's going on in our experience, in our mind? And also the basic question is, are we even sure that there's a compatible and universal structure between all humans? I mean, we seem to be able to communicate quite well, but depending on where you come from philosophically, that's not so clear why that would be the case. I mean, we don't find it surprising because we're used to it, but when you look at it closely, you might want to explain why every human more or less comes up with a compatible way to explain the world and why we can communicate about that. So if there is such a thing, if there is a universal structure in our experience and in our phenomenology, can we describe it? Can we describe it mathematically? This is a conference of mathematical models of consciousness. And not just describe it, can we predict it from something else? And if so, would it generalize to animals, plants, and also AI, when we had a number of talks on AI here. So we'll not be talking, or I'll not be talking so much here about consciousness, which often has to do with the reflection part of seeing yourself in some context. but I'm going one step lower, and I'm going to be talking about perception. And again, this is the term that can be mixed for people, so it can mean the same thing or it can be very overlapping. When we say perception here, it's really the process of which creates and shapes subjective experience without saying in advance what that's supposed to be or how that's supposed to go. Now here comes the bad news. If you look into perception, general theories of perception are equally tricky. There's also a lot of confusion of possible, and there's a lot of talk, and philosophical talk has been around that, which part is perception and so on. So maybe we need to go a little higher focus as well. And that we do that by focusing on embodied perception. So we'll look at now a model or a setting where we assume that there's a body required for perception, that there's no ethereal spirit somehow, and try to describe a model of a biological setting. That is not to say that we're going to mean that any mind needs to be biologically implemented, but it needs to be implemented somehow. That much I'll go for. So I'll share three main motivations. So these motivations are assumptions that go into the model. So these motivations are, I can't prove them, I won't argue for them philosophically, but I take them to be reasonably sound enough to base my work on it. The first one is the following assumption. It's that if you find a human in two different mental states, if there's any subjective difference so that the human can report on or can feel the difference, not even report, between two mental states, then there is a difference in body states. So an observer with a very good microscope or see a MRI or whatever, or something very fancy machinery could see it. So that is to say, let's not believe in zombies. Let's not believe in spirits. So let's assume that if there's a mental state difference, then there's also a bodily state difference. So that means if we believe that, then we have a chance to investigate the body instead, and maybe derive statements about the mind from observing statements in the body. That's motivation number one. Motivation number two is about a certain intentionality in the philosophical sense, which is that if you model perception, then you want to have a model that explains our naive understanding of perception, which is that there is a world and there's a mind and there's a sort of certain duality to it. And it should be such that the mind part that you're modeling, the part that you model as the mental part, should carry information, in a very fuzzy sense of the word, should carry information about that other part, which is independent of yourself. If your model doesn't explain that, most people will consider it a useless model. So that's the second motivation that goes in here. And the third motivation is, it's hiding behind the video screen, is that any structure that we accept, why would there be any structure, is derived from structure that comes from life and evolution. That is a big jump, that is a big input into this model, and I hope that I can motivate it over the course of the talk as well. But it's a design choice at this point, and the question goes away a little bit from the what's it like to be a human to asking in what all ways can you actually be alive as a human, because perception happens to living humans only as far as we know. We haven't seen any other examples reliably. And life is a very strong agent to create structure. You've already seen it in the bonus section on the color bit. I will be leaning towards structuralist approaches or towards structuralist view a lot. So the central question of where should structure come from? Why should there be any structure? I am suggesting a path by saying, look at life and life as a shaping agent in the world. And if you're living life, then you even get a subjective view for it. So now we come to the main part of this talk, which is embodied information in life. That's how this should be titled. There's still a lot of metaphysics involved, and the main drive behind this, or the main drive behind the early parts of this model, were to remove this. You want to do consciousness science. We want to enable mathematical consciousness science. So we want to enable researchers which don't have to deal with philosophy all the time by giving them mathematical tooling. So we have to do it once, but we have to anchor our logic, our model in metaphysical argumentation once, if you want, but it should be so rigid or you're so solid afterwards that we don't have to do it every time. It should be a tool set that you can take away and give to a researcher, a biologist, a physicist, a psychologist, or a mathematician to deal with. And what I'm suggesting to do for that is to not focus on even perception. That's too overloaded as a topic. I'm suggesting to instead rather investigate a concept I call embodied information, and I'm defining it on the next slide. Why? This concept should have the benefit, or will have the benefit, that it's not metaphysically overloaded. It's something that you can define in a mathematical sense, and it might be sufficient to do a lot of structural arguments in this area of research. So let's define it. Let's have a look at embodied information. What do I mean by that? And embodied information should be something that is contained in one object about another. So the property of one entity, I'd call it the carrier, which enables the generation of correct statements about another entity. So you have this bar scale here on the picture. Because there's a lot of context. So because the bar scale is in balance and you have two spheres on it, if you take one of the spheres, or if you look at one of the spheres, you basically know, if you know about bar scales, but you basically know that the weight of the black sphere is the same as the weight of the white sphere. So you don't have to look at the white sphere itself for that. That's the simplest example here. But the question is going to be, how is there information in the black sphere in this entire setting? And I give you another illustration, maybe that's a little more adequate because it's a little more complex and it shows a little bit more what's happening. Think you have a bowl of white and black marbles and you know that it's 50-50 distributed. So you have 100 whites, 100 black marbles in there. Now you pick one marble out and you cast away the ball, or you hide it somewhere. And I give you this one marble. And just by looking at this one marble, you now have information about the bowl, or about the ratio of marbles in the bowl. If it's a white marble, you know there's more black marbles in the bowl than white marbles. That's a relational statement about the number of marbles in the bowl. It takes a lot of context, and it doesn't just stick to the marble. But still, in a way, the key piece is that it's sort of attached to this marble. That's why I'm calling it embodied information, but that's the idea behind it. So let's have another look. What does that require? You need, first of all, a way to describe the first entity, so the marble, as you need a structure to describe the bowl, the number of marbles in there. And you need some logical and rigid coupling between the two for that to make any sense. And how are we going to apply that? We're going to apply that to the living body, or the body specifically. And we're going to ask, how does a body, a living body, carry any information, and what kind of information does a living body really carry? So we need to define or identify a suitable universal structure that is there in every human body, not just in some human bodies, that in every human who can communicate should have that structure, because that's the level of universality we're looking at. And what should it classify? Should it classify the world? That's where we sort of, again, take a little bit of a metaphysical input here. We're not leaning towards full realism, that we say the world is just there. But let's say if you have a body already, if you accept that there's a body, then you probably will accept that there are certain interactions that that body has with an environment. So let's classify those. So those interactions then also need to be structurally classified. And we said, where does structure come from? So if we pick those structures, it shouldn't be completely arbitrary. There's a lot of going on in the body. If you allow all physics for description, you have every single atom going places and going wild, and electrons and whatever. But let's not go there. Let's look at what relevant structure is there. And we said that was our assumption 3, or our motivation number 3, that we look at structure that comes from life. And the way that information has entered the body that's something we can sort of agree on, I believe. The way that information has entered the body is because our ancestors have died and procreated, and some of them have survived, any combination thereof. But also, and that gets easily overlooked, in your individual body, you start as one single zygote, one single cell essentially, that divides multiple times, but it divides highly asymmetrically. So every species has their own logic how that works in the end. But you end up, every cell division and every death of a cell is also a way how the environment enters information into your now existing body. So if we take this together and we're going to the structural side again, what entities can we talk about? We can talk about individual cells. I'm not going to go into enactivism and autopoietic definition of autopoiesis as much, but saying every individual cell is alive, and therefore I will accept that it's an entity that I can reason with, or not that I can deal with. I'm not going to reason with a cell, but I accept that it exists as an entity because in time or over time, because it is alive and it has these structural features, structural consistency over time as a sort of definition of life. So I'll accept that cells are entities. I'll accept that the entire organism, so the orchestrated organization of cells, the entire human body, also is alive and is an entity. And I accept that cells have certain relations. The ancestry relations I talked about as one example. And is that already enough? Can we describe some state with that? How much can we describe? And let's start from an intuitive path by describing the various states you can describe in the body. So if you take it a snapshot state, which is like one point in time, sort of look at the body very briefly, you can talk about the mass of each cell. You can talk about the mass of the body, including what is not in cells, say in your blood vessels, that is not technically in a cell, possibly in the stomach. I don't mind, I don't know. It's an inspiration to understand what I'm talking about. So you might have any of these living entities that we discussed accumulates and maintains some level of mass, possibly. So that's one level of snapshot state we can describe. Then we can describe how the activity of every cell to a point. And I'm just looking for one variable there, maybe just how fast, what's the rate of metabolism. So I'm not trying to describe every protein interacting, folding with or whatever, but maybe just the amount of throughput of mass that the cell has. There's something as simple as that. And if you look at that, if some cell lives a bit faster or lives a bit hotter and has a higher rate of metabolism, that will affect its neighbors in the body. So they will then also change their speed and adjust. So you will basically give some sort of ripples in the speed of cell activity throughout the body. If a neuron fires, that is a high metabolic activity, or it's the release of a lot of energy that it has accumulated beforehand. If it fires, it will affect all sorts of cells in the neighborhood. So this includes that kind of activity. And finally, or one more consideration, now we talked about activity, which is activity in a snap. You can think about it as a gradient in time, speeds, and so on. But now if you talk about long time frames, dynamical state is a bit of an oxymoron. Either it's a state or it's dynamical, but dynamical state, so we have this notion that our perception, that what we feel, what we see, the world we live in, is very, very stable. It doesn't change all that much. And I'm not talking about elections or that kind of time frame. And I'm talking on a small scale in your day-to-day life. You stay in the same room, you stay in the same in the same area. But your body is highly active in that time. So how does that get together? And the way to go about that, we'll see, or we have to model in detail, is that if you have invariance, repetition, or periodicity in activity, and also interactivity, because we are trying to classify the interaction of your body with the world. So we can talk about invariance in activity, so activity that keeps repeating itself, say, any kind of periodicity. And now comes a bit of a jump, and this talk is really more of an intuition than a ready-made theory, but I really hope that I can sort of bring that spark over to you, to what I'm talking about, or why I'm thinking it's worth to investigate this in more depth and more detail from a mathematical side. So I'm now going to introduce a concept which doesn't really 100% apply, because we don't have, in our structure of the body, we don't really have a vector space or something that nicely behaved quite yet. But I wanted to carry over some of the concepts that we know from linear and functional algebra So, and if you have operators operating on a certain space, you can talk about something that is called an eigenmode. I've always been wondering why the mathematicians 100 years ago called it that, but I never gotten a good answer. But if you come from math, this is a concept that you're very familiar with. It's a very fundamental concept in linear algebra. It is a behavior of an operator. It's a behavior of an ongoing activity, you can think, that describes a certain invariance. If you have a rotation, it describes the axis of the rotation. Or just, yeah, I should not try to do an impromptu definition of this, trying to stay out of math while introducing it. But the point about it is, if you have shapes like the violin here on the left, and you make this shape to oscillate, or you make this shape to vibrate, then there is certain shapes and certain ways in which this violin likes to vibrate. So there's certain ways in which a violin can oscillate, and there's certain ways in which it won't, or it really shouldn't, or you'll know if that's not one of the right ways. So which modes and which frequencies, which modes a violin has, how it can oscillate as a violin, that is determined by its shape largely and by its material. Like how it really oscillates then is so when you strike it with a bow, how much it really oscillates then, or at what frequency it oscillates, that has to do with how you strike it. So that is a characteristic of the interaction and of a regular interaction with the environment. So these first two things, eigenmodes, there's also eigenfrequencies, let's not go there. So eigenmodes are characteristic to a shape, and a resonance is now a description. That's something you might be familiar with. If you excite a certain system in a regular way, then if that excitation matches its own characteristics, in that case the eigenmodes, then it will take up energy from you, and it will accumulate that energy. But the point here for me is that if you are in a state where the violin is struck by a bow and it makes a sound for a long time, it carries information, and that for the violin it's the information that the bow has been struck on the right string, for example. And let's go a little bit further. If you've seen gluttony figures, if you've seen metal shapes, usually squares as a standard example, putting some sand over it, putting it into an oscillation, you'll see that very characteristic patterns will emerge of where the plate moves and where it doesn't move. Look it up. I'll again not go too far into the... I won't be able to convey the full picture in the limited time that we have here. But what I'm advertising, or what I want to say, is that if we can classify eigenmodes or something very similar to it of the human body under a metabolic activity, so under the speed of metabolism, where the waves and the propagation of waves through the body changes as the body learns and changes as the body grows, then that can be a possible foundation to characterize the interactions of this body with the environment. And that may be a foundation to characterize and expose structure in phenomenal space. And because we know that the structure we picked is relatively similar between all humans, this may be a good basis to find a common basis for all humans or many humans. This is a bit of a far out idea, but I feel I can at least present you with the strongest support for it. Now that's coming here. Cell division itself, cell division in the body, highly chemical, biochemical process, happens as the attaining of a resonance. So there's papers from a Göttingen lab and others by now, that basically the concentrations of proteins on a membrane will self-arrange and self-structure in such a way that it forms a standing wave, and once the standing wave is formed, you found a node line where the third protein, which then marks the cutting, it's sort of illustrated on this slide, the third protein which marks the cutting will mark the cutting along a node line, a line where there's no movement during the oscillation. That is the sort of characterization of an eigenmode. So I find that incredibly fascinating, and if anybody sort of agrees with me on this notion, then please reach out to me. I know this is not the questions and answer session in Bamberg anymore, but do reach out. I want to provide a short summary of what we looked at. So I propose that the general approach to look into phenomenology could be to investigate structure that is induced by ongoing life without assuming any structure in the environment. And that we can probably restrict ourselves to look at structure which comes only from properties of life itself. And if you want to keep the metaphysical part low, we don't need to talk phenomenology. We can talk information directly, like only information, and it should be rich enough. So that's my hope here. And of course, you can't do this without arguing a little bit, or at least hinting towards where you want to be metaphysically. So I think this deviates a little bit in the underbelly from physical reductionism, that I can imagine a scenario where this reduces to a physics which is sort of a little removed, which is a little reduced itself. So if the notion of geometrical space, of space as in space-time, the space and the geometrical part of that may not be as fundamental as we think it is. So if instead we just take associations of molecules to each other, and time and structure from life, we might find the foundation for space and a foundation for, at the same time, psychology already. This is, again, it's a reach. This entire talk is a reach, but I'm very thankful to the organizers to allow this kind of speculation and speculative talk, and also for the opportunity to do it again after it got lost. So thank you very much. And with that, once back to the beautiful picture.